Welcome back to the last of the Imagine model series. This time we are going to talk about pressuring, which is a step that you would take after you have tried persuasion and found that it didn't work. If your project is important enough, even after all of the best persuading that you can, people still aren't involved, or you've got a lot of people, but people in power might not be supporting your project or your community, then you would start going into some of the more confrontive or combative styles of trying to get people on your side. So this goes from bad to worse. If you still have to do something rather than nothing, one option is always to get a petition. If you've got a lot of people that are supporting you and your project, get them to sign a paper that say, hey, we, the undersigned, demand this change. Sometimes that makes things work, but if any of you are familiar with the progressive site Move On, they have a petition for just about everything and do very, very little. So if you are going to have some sort of petition, don't make it an online one. Those ones very rarely seem to work. One exception to that would be petitions to whitehouse.gov. Interestingly enough, if enough people sign for some sort of petition, the White House does have to respond. I believe they need 10,000 signatures for a particular petition. In fact, and you guys can look this up if you don't believe me, there was a petition signed for President Obama to create a Death Star, and it got enough signatures, and he did respond to it. He did say, cool idea, but we can do so much more with our science that can solve real life problems here. That's the gist of it. Look it up if you don't believe me. Obama's response to the Death Star petition. Next, open confrontations. This is where you would actually call people out on the floor in front of others, being willing to put their feet to the fire and say, hey, we've got this important thing. Why aren't you approaching us? Why aren't you helping us with this? This would be open demonstrations, uh, protests, those kinds of things. Those are open confrontations that you can use to help get people on your side. Sometimes that works. Other times it doesn't. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen the protesters that will usually they're union workers who will stand outside of organizations and say, hey, we have a labor dispute with this organization, shame on you. And there's 2 or 3 paid workers that are there holding up a sign. How much does that work and how much of that is just tradition? I don't know. But if you're going to do an open protest, it helps to have a lot of people. So keep that in mind. Bring in other agencies. If there are other agencies that are working with the same population, that are on board, that also have some sort of stake in the community or stake in the population, and your organization is lagging, then sometimes that kind of pressure will bring them along. Go to the news. This is actually one of my favorite macro level interventions, getting investigative reporters on a case. And I think of a case where there was an agency that provided services to behaviorally difficult adolescents. There are plenty of agencies out there that are like that, but they were not ever allowed to tell the clients no. They were not ever allowed to use any kind of physical restraints on them. And so what we found is that there were a lot of young mothers, young women in the community who got a job there and were constantly being essentially sexually assaulted by the clients. And the agency did nothing to help out their workers. This was the kind of thing I knew a student that worked there, and I really wish that she would have taken it to the news because that was an agency I think should have been exposed. They were creating problems for the workers. And on top of that, I don't think that that actually provided any kind of safety for the clients. If the clients could assault the workers, what was going to stop them from assaulting each other? So go to the news. Sometimes making a stink of things in the news will really bring about social change. Informational picketing. This is another fun one. This goes along with um, what we had talked about in terms of open confrontation. Encouraging the subversion of services, sabotaging services. If an agency is doing something that seems like is not in the best interests of your community, they might be providing some sort of health hazard. Um, then you can encourage subversion of services if you can get workers that are there who might feel safe, see if they can find ways to shut down machines, or um, there's lots of different ways to do this, and it's really hard to be general about it. Um, so just consider that for what it is: subversion of services. You are essentially trying to sabotage some sort of enterprise from working because it's causing some sort of problem that is unacceptable for the community. You can go on strike. This helps if it's organized and you've got a lot of people, especially within organizations. If you're going to say, hey, we're all just going to like stop working, uh, that will get administration to pay attention to you because they don't get paid if you don't get paid. So that's an option. You can go to the courts, so lawsuits. Um, those sometimes, just the threat of those sometimes is enough to get people to back down and try to get on your side. That is an expensive and it can be a very difficult process. You'll need lawyers. That can be expensive, but just know that that's an option. And then finally, if none of those other things work, you can see if you can find some sort of formal bargaining that you can do to make sure that you have a fair way to reach some sort of agreement or settlement if that's really what is necessary for your project to move forward. These are all great tools. I want to let you know that you're all free to use them. Having said that, you don't have to use them, and I would say use them if you need to, and that's it. Because otherwise, these kinds of practices are hard to do, they're hard to organize, they take a lot of effort and energy, and they don't always work. But sometimes these are the ways that get things done. So make sure that you've really evaluated uh, the potential for it to work before you undergo such practices. Okay, next we are going to finish up with the E for the Imagine model. And this is essentially evaluating your progress. And that's going back and see if it worked. That's something that you have to do with all of your interventions at the end. Did it work? How well did it go? What are the kinds of things that you are going to be able to report on when you do your presentation? That's really important. And I want to make a quick note here that when you do your project, I really want you to begin with the end in mind. Every semester, I have students who come forth and they give their presentations. Invariably, there is at least one group that has done a project that kicks so much ass that everyone is just floored by it. And then there are some who put together some piddly little project that doesn't make very much impact on anyone and no one really seems to care. Be in that first group, not in the last group. If you're going to take on something, just take it on with your full passion and make something cool happen. I've had lots of really cool projects that I remember and I keep near and dear to my heart, and there's a lot that happen that are just whatever and they're very forgettable. Don't be in the forgettable category. Think about how you want this to look at the end. What can you actually say you accomplished? That's what should be in your evaluation part of your paper. How did this actually happen? And how will we know when we've been successful? Sometimes it will be we've got these checklists that are done, but think about how you are going to be able to assess that. What kind of evidence can you bring forward that your project mattered? Okay, so moving forward with your projects, you should have just about everything that you need, except here it says something about be aware of Murphy's Law. So some general guidelines to keep in mind as you go through your project. Murphy's Law will invariably affect your project. So here's some of the examples of Murphy's Law that will or may affect your project. First off, nothing is as easy as it looks. Even some of the most magnificent projects that have been done in my classes, even if they made it look easy, they weren't. There is a lot of work and effort and energy that goes into these projects. So be aware of that as you start to take them on. It's going to take more than you think. Everything takes longer than you think. I had one project that was putting together some housing units for mentally ill, and they had to spend half of a semester waiting for bids uh, before they could actually do anything. Uh, and they were really upset by that because like they hadn't anticipated that. They had to spend half of the semester in limbo, and that made it very difficult for them to actually get their project done. When there is a possibility of several things going wrong, the one that will cause the most damage will be the one to go wrong. That's another truism. Just be sure that you pay attention to those things. What are the ones that are most likely to fail or the ones that will cause the most damage? So again, when you look at your PERT charts, make sure that you are aware of where are the points of catastrophic failure and what are you going to do to protect against them. If you see 4 possible ways that things can go wrong, a 5th will quickly develop. Obviously, there's no way to anticipate all of the different ways that a project can fail. There are lots of them, and so just be aware of that. When left on their own, things will go from bad to worse. If you leave a project going and you aren't supervising it, or you just expect people to move things forward for you, that generally doesn't happen. So make sure that you are keeping up on your monitoring of this project. Whenever you set out to do something, something else must always be done first. I'm sure many of you experience this on a regular basis when you do your homework. I've got to write this paper. Oh, but Facebook wants me to check out I have all these notifications I've got to get to first. Yeah, I do that too. So something else has to be done first. Just be aware that that's going to be a project. That's something that will draw out your project. Every solution breeds new problems. Be aware that you won't be able to make everyone happy. Some people are going to look at your project and say, well, what about us? We have to suffer through all of this now. And so, yeah, that sucks. It is impossible to make anything foolproof because fools are so ingenious. This goes to the concept of, if you're making a project happen that requires people to come in and get involved that might not necessarily get involved, they need a simple process, you will find people that can't do it. One of my favorite examples is trying to get academics to line up. We deal with this every semester at graduation, and it's like, all right, well, we got all these people, we got to line up, and well, what do you do when it's your group's turn to graduate? Who goes where and who's going to sit where and who's going to stand where and how are you going to leave, and you'd be surprised, all of these really basic things trip us up. So it doesn't matter how smart you are, you'll find a way to be a fool about things. And then finally, just remember that nature always sides with the hidden flaw. Anything that can go wrong probably will go wrong, and they might be the kinds of things you can't anticipate. So just be aware that these things always come up. and do your best in your paper to address how you're going to work with it. Best of luck. Ask questions.